Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. It's been a while since I did a mini PC review, and that's what we're going to do here today. We're going to take a look at the SER9 Pro, and there's nothing really revolutionary about this one in the first place. In fact, it looks a lot like the SER8 that came out last year. The gaming performance on this is about the same as well. It's got the same integrated GPU inside. And you might be thinking to yourself, why on earth would Russ be making a video about this thing if he already did one that's very similar? And it really just comes down to the price. Last year's SER8 mini PC debuted at $650, and even though it's dropped down in price since then, it's still around $540 or $550, whereas this one is debuting at $500. And in this world of rising costs, it's kind of crazy that they're coming out with a new mini PC that's even cheaper than the one before. And so in this video, I'm going to explain why I think that this is the best mini PC that you can find for $500 new right now. So grab your favorite snack, let's go ahead and get started. As always, we'll start with the specs. So the CPU on this one is the Ryzen 7 H255, and before making this video, I had no idea what this CPU was either. My understanding is that this is a CPU that's only sold in China, and it's essentially a rebranded version of the Ryzen 7 260. This is a Hawk Point chip with the Zen 4 architecture, 8 cores and 16 threads, and it's got a base clock of 3.8 GHz and can boost up to 5.1. Its integrated graphics is the Radeon 780M. That's the same as the Ryzen 8000 series that we saw mostly last year and the year before, and it's the same GPU that you would find in the Z1 Extreme, so the ROG Ally and the original Legion Go. And so performance-wise, we already kind of know what we're going to be getting here. It's the same sort of performance that we've seen over the past couple of years. But there are some unique elements to this one. It has LPDDR5X RAM clocked at 6400 megatransfers per second, and this is soldered onto the board, which makes it a lot faster. This will give you about 15% faster read and write speeds compared to RAM that you can install yourself. The bummer about soldered on RAM is that you can't swap it out yourself, but thankfully they did load it up with 32 gigabytes, which I think is going to be excellent for most gaming scenarios. Now in terms of storage, they've got a 1TB 2280 SSD inside, and there's also room for a second M.2 drive. And we have 3 different ways of providing video out. There's DisplayPort 1.4, HDMI that goes up to 4K and 240 Hz, and then you have a USB 4 port on the back as well. In terms of connectivity, we've got Wi-Fi 6 with an Intel branded card, and then Bluetooth 5.2. It's got a couple other bells and whistles, including a built-in speaker and microphone, and we will test out the speakers in this video. And that's really about it in terms of specs. It's running Windows 11 Home, and it's got a 100-watt power supply. Now in terms of pricing, it's $500 on their website with free shipping. And that's going to be the fully spec'd out model with RAM and storage and everything else. Now if you want, there's actually a model that removes the speaker and microphone array, and it'll save you $20, but as of making this video, it's only available in the European Union. Now I've been poking and prodding this thing for a couple months now, so it's been out for a while and it's already up on Amazon. It's about the same price, a little bit more expensive, $510. But depending on where you live, buying it from Amazon might give you more peace of mind because you don't have to worry about, getting it shipped over from China or working directly with the company if you want to return it. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, probably the most compelling thing about this mini PC is its introductory price. This thing is a lot cheaper than last year's model. Even though the SER8 has dropped in price down to about $540, it's still more expensive than the new one today. And I think this $500 price point is a good sweet spot because anything beyond that gets a lot more expensive. For example, they do have an AI9HX370 version of this same mini PC, but it's nearly double the price, and it's not going to give you double the performance. Instead, it's really only about a 20-25% uplift. And so this is what I mean by being in its sweet spot. Yes, there are more powerful options out there, but you're going to pay for it. And I think that, around the $500 price point, I haven't seen this much good value right out the gate. Okay, let's take a look inside of the box, and of note, this is a review unit sent over from Beelink, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Like with a lot of their products, the box is super compact, and we only have one SKU here, 32 gigs and 1 terabyte. That's the one I'm testing here today. Inside the box, it's super simple. We've got a 100-watt charging brick, which is of a pretty good size. Then we have a small HDMI cable, a quick start guide, and then of course the computer itself. And first impressions, this is an aluminum shell. It actually feels pretty nice, kind of heavyweight. And then the back here is kind of rubberized plastic. On the bottom, we've got some ventilation, a little tab here to be able to pull it out if you take off these screws, which we'll do in a moment. And then of course, 2 feet to keep it elevated. In terms of size, we're looking at about 2.5 sticks of Kerrygold butter, and then also maybe a little bit larger than an Xbox controller, but you can kind of get a feel for it right here. Now looking at the front, we've got these 4 holes right here. This is the microphone array. Even if you save $20 and get the device without the microphone, it's still going to have these 4 holes, which is kind of unfortunate because I think it looks otherwise very, very clean. And for a guy who's not going to be using the microphone much, it just kind of stands out a little bit. Below that, we've got the power button. This will show a white LED ring right here when it's turned on. After that, we have the clear CMOS button, a headphone microphone jack, then a 10 gigabit per second USB-C connection, and then a USB 3.2 Gen 2, also 10 gigabit per second. There's nothing going on either side, so let's look at the back. So first thing is we have this huge heatsink and exhaust right here, but then underneath it we have a bunch more I/O. This top one is also USB 3.2 Gen 2, so 10 gigabit per second. The one below is just USB 2.0, which means it's going to be like 480 megabits per second. The Ethernet port is 2.5 gigabits, then we have a DisplayPort 1.4, HDMI that can go up to 4K 240 Hertz. Below that we have the HDMI port, and then our only USB 4 port right here, and then finally our barrel jack. Now tearing down this PC is pretty easy. We've got a front cover that has these 4 little screws that are hidden behind the rubber pads. So you have to take those off, and then it's just Phillips head screws. Below that is a dust cover, which has got the speaker attachment on it. And then below that, we have the actual M.2 drives. There's a huge heatsink right here that you'll have to remove in order to access them, but there are 2 different slots down below. And so this is what it looks like underneath. We've got our SSD 1 terabyte Phison brand. And then we also have space for another 2280, and below that, space for a 2230. This is going to be our Wi-Fi chip. So overall, it's pretty easy to tear this thing down in order to change out the storage, but just bear in mind that the RAM is soldered onto the board, so you're not going to be able to upgrade the RAM. It's only going to be the storage and the Wi-Fi module. Now, another easy way to get storage added to your device without having to tear it down would be this little accessory called the Mate SE, and they sent this over to review as well. This costs $140 on their website, and it's basically a USB-C expansion dock. So inside this box, we get the device itself, and then also 2 connectors for your computer, depending on whether or not you want to have this thing above or below your mini PC. And this is going to work with the SER8 and SER9 line of devices from Beelink. The front is pretty bare other than this one LED light that will turn on when you have this plugged in. That's about it. On the right, we've got an SD 4.0 slot. This should give you speeds up to 300 megabits per second. On the back, we've got all this extra I/O, and if you ask me, this is where things get a little bit wonky. So this one right here is going to line up with the device. We'll do it here in a moment. So that's just going to provide your data transfer. It's going to be 80 gigabit per second. These 2 USB-A ports are USB 3.0, which means they are 5 gigabits per second. And then we have a 2.5 gigabit LAN that we also still have on the mini PC itself. Now this one on the far right is kind of crazy. This only provides power in if you need it. So the computer can power this device up to 15 watts. So if you have 2 peripherals hooked up and they require less than 15 watts, you're good to go. You don't have to use anything, but this USB-C port isn't going to do anything. It's only there to provide additional power if these 2 ports need more than 15 watts. So in the end, you're not getting a lot of I/O with this $140 accessory. You are getting the ability to use an SD card reader, which might be important, and then you're losing your USB 4 port to be able to connect to this, but you're gaining 2 USB-A ports and another Ethernet, and that's really about it. Now connecting these 2 is pretty simple. You just put it on top and then it just kind of sits in place because of those rubber feet down below. And so this is what it looks like here. You've got a slight gap to allow for airflow. And then of course you have the bottom here, which has its own fan as well. We'll check it out here in a moment. So when you have a layout like this, you would use the smaller connector and just plug it right in. And so that will now power these 2 USB ports, but you're losing your USB 4 port. You can also attach it above like a little hat, but it is a little bit weird that we have these indentations on the top of it. But yes, you can do this as well. For this setup, you would use the longer attachment and then plug it in, and it's going to be the exact same experience. Personally, I've been putting it down below, but you can put it up above if you would like. So in terms of additional I/O, I don't see a lot of value in the Mate SE just because you're losing your 1 USB 4 port in order to get 2 USB-A 3.0 ports. But the other thing about it is it has 2 M.2 slots underneath. Now to get to the M.2 slots, it's kind of ridiculous. You have to pull off the rubber feet and then access the screws underneath. I really think that they should have made the screws exposed to make it a lot easier to get in and out. Thankfully, the screw holes are only on the edges, so you only have to take off the little corners on each side, but still, it's kind of a funky design. So underneath, this is what it looks like. We've got our two SSD slots, and we actually have to pull this entire covering off to get to them as well. Of note, this thing will only work if you put the SSD in the first slot before putting in the second slot. If you only put a drive on the second slot, it's not going to be read. You actually have to use the first one, then the second one. So it is possible to have two going at once, but if you're only going to have one, make sure you put it on the left. So this is what it looks like underneath. We've got two M.2 slots. We also have some thermal pads for the heatsink. You need to remove the plastic on top of them first, but yeah, that's really about it. Pretty simple setup, but not something that I would want to do frequently. So putting it all together, I can't really recommend this particular accessory, especially because you're losing your USB 4 port in favor of two USB-A ports, and that's really about it. Now, in terms of I/O, I think if you're desperate for an SD card reader, maybe this would make sense, but I also think there are more elegant USB solutions out there. It really comes down to the M.2 drives that we have underneath, and if you want to have 4 total drives, 2 here, 2 on the device, then maybe this might be a solution for you, but again, I think that USB solutions might be a little bit more elegant. So putting it all together, I think that the design of the SER9 is nice. It looks clean. I'm not a huge fan of the microphone holes, but otherwise I think we've got good I/O on the front and the back. When it comes to the Mate SE, I can't really recommend this just because it's $140 and it's got a lot less I/O than I would expect. You're losing your USB 4 port for something that may not be of a lot of value. Now, before we jump into performance benchmarks, let's do a quick test of its audio quality, in particular when it comes to the speakers that are built inside. This is not the first time that Beelink has done it, but I've never really been impressed with the overall audio quality. There's many factors to it. The first is that this is an aluminum shell, and then also the speakers are pointing downwards, and so I've never really found it to be a good audio experience. Here's a quick music test using a song from my friend Jim. He's the same guy who made the intro music for this channel, and he makes some awesome music over on Bandcamp under the name Our Ghost. I'll leave a link down below. So right off the bat, you can probably hear that it's quite muffled. I would not enjoy listening to music out of the box like this. Let's also do a quick sample of voice tracks in case you wanted to use this for, say, for example, voice chat. We'll use the sultry tones of yours truly. About the same size as a Nintendo Switch Lite as well. So I think it's a pretty cool match to have something same screen size and same colors. And same thing here, it sounds very muffled to me. So the way that I'm looking at it is that this will probably work in a pinch. If, for example, you don't have any speakers on your desktop and you want to hear something really quickly, or maybe you have to jump into a Zoom call just right then and there, then yes, maybe these speakers would work. But in general, you're probably better off getting desktop speakers. Okay, now let's jump into benchmarks. We'll do some CPU benchmarks as well as thermal testing, and then we'll move into GPU. So first thing on idle, it's going to pull about 6 or 7 watts from the CPU, so that's pretty low powered, and it's going to stay relatively cool, usually an average about 38 degrees Celsius when not doing anything intensive. Now, running something that's CPU intensive like Cinebench will push the CPU to 100%, and it's going to push up the max power to about 65 watts. And this is a 10-minute test, and I would say about halfway through I started to see some pretty high spikes in temperature, usually around 87 or 88 degrees Celsius. Now, the TJ max on this computer is 100 degrees Celsius. That means it's not going to do any thermal throttling until you reach that threshold. But still, for me, anything that's above like 80, 85 degrees Celsius is a little bit worrying. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the ambient temperature can affect this greatly, and I live in Hawaii and I have the AC off during this testing, so this is probably a lot hotter than it'll be in cooler climates. In all things considered, I would say this is pretty adequate cooling given that we are pushing it a full 65 watt TDP, and it's a very small box that's covered in metal. And so in the end, I'm not super concerned about these temperatures, especially because this is a benchmark and often you probably won't be pushing it that hard. When actually playing games, it runs a lot cooler. And so worst case scenario that I'm seeing here in a hot climate is 2 cores reaching 90 degrees Celsius. In general, I would say this cooling is good. And for anybody watching the numbers, the multi-core Cinebench score was 14,824, which is pretty decent for the CPU. Now, in addition to the temperatures themselves, another big thing about mini PC cooling is how loud does the thing get? And here in the studio with the AC off and while on idle, I got around 41, 42 decibels altogether. And at that point, that's basically silent because that's the noise floor at my studio. I've got a big window on one side of it, and so I get a lot of noise leaking through. Now, when pushing it to the max, it only goes up maybe 1 or 2 decibels, 43 to 44. So yes, this remains basically silent the entire time. In all of my testing, there was never a moment where I actually heard the fans. I had to go and put my ear next to the mini PC just to see if something was happening. If you don't believe me, here's a quick audio sample of it running at max, and I bet you're not going to be able to hear anything. So putting it all together, given its small size, I think that the cooling here is excellent, and I was surprised to find that, yes, the fan is basically silent. So now let's talk about benchmark scores, and we'll use 3D Mark's TimeSpy as our example. And the score here is about exactly what I would expect from the Radeon 780M. It's 3487. For a comparison, last year's SER9 got 3348, so about a 4 to 5% difference between the two, and exactly what I would think for this particular integrated GPU. Now, on their website, Beelink says that there is a balanced and performance mode, and you can change that in the BIOS, and so it's pretty easy to find. It's in the OEM features management section, and it's just a matter of swapping it over from balanced to the performance mode. This is supposed to boost it up to a 65 watt TDP. However, I found that in actual testing and moving it over, it didn't seem to do anything different. Either the balanced mode is already in performance mode, or the performance mode is actually not boosting in any way. The power profile still hovered between 55 and 65 watts, depending on the task, and the score here was only 2% better than it was before I had changed it. To complicate things even further, it's about 2% lower in the TimeSpy score, so yeah, this doesn't really seem to be doing anything. And I'm not sure what's going on here, maybe it needs a new BIOS update, but as it stands, I couldn't find any difference between balance and performance. And so for this video, I did all of my testing in the default balance mode. That's what you're going to get out of the box. I think that's a better representation of your average mini PC user. We're going to start with PC gaming and work our way up from the very lightweight stuff to pushing it as far as I can in the harder to play games. When jumping into the really lightweight stuff like Celeste, you can see it's only taking up about 7% of the GPU, so this thing is going to run at about a 7 watt TDP. Moving up to something like Cuphead is a little bit more intensive, but not by much. It only takes about 20% of the GPU power, and so yes, this is going to be excellent for lightweight games. And this is right in line with what you can expect from, similar handheld devices that run the Radeon 780M. But one of the nice things about a mini PC is that you don't have to worry about battery life, so you can just kind of leave it at the default settings and it'll take care of the rest. Now, one thing you can do with lightweight games is unlock the frame cap to really push it to a higher level, especially if you've got a high refresh rate monitor. So for example, a game like Hades 2 can run at 1080p medium settings and give you an average about like 180 to 200 frames per second. So yes, you've got a lot of power to work with here. That's going to really come into play with competitive shooters. Here is Counter-Strike 2 as an example, 1080p medium settings and average about 115 frames per second. So if you play these fast twitch shooter games, this might be an excellent fit. This CPU will also do an excellent job when playing some older titles like the Xbox 360 era. With 1080p medium settings, I got an average about 140 frames per second with BioShock Infinite. For Grand Theft Auto 5 at, again, 1080p medium settings, I got an average about 110 frames per second. So yes, you'll be able to have high refresh rate gaming with some of these older titles. I think it looks pretty cool. Other titles that are also older but maybe a bit more demanding, like Skyrim, can play at 1080p high settings and get you a pretty steady average of 58 to 60 frames per second. It's similar with Rise of the Tomb Raider. This one will mostly run at 60 frames per second until something really graphically intensive happens, and it'll dip down somewhere around like 50-55 frames per second. Still very playable for me, and it's an excellent visual experience. Moving on to more recent releases, we'll start with Doom Eternal, 1080p medium settings here, and the average frame rate for me was around 70 frames per second. What I would probably do in this instance is cap it at 60 and just enjoy it like that. It's a very similar experience with Final Fantasy VII Remake. This one on average maybe 60 frames per second, except for when you're in combat, then it'll dip down to, around 50 frames per second. This game always dips when in combat, so I'm not surprised to see that. So this is about what I would expect again with this CPU. Once you get into more intensive games, I would say around that PS4 era, things like Horizon Zero Dawn, you can play this one at 1080p low settings, or performance settings as they call it in the game, and that'll give you an average about 40 frames per second. I don't think that's terrible. It's still relatively smooth and a lot better than the standard 30 frames per second you'll get in a lot of these cinematic style games, and so yes, this is an excellent experience too. A lot of the other Sony titles that have been ported over to PC will perform about the same, so I would expect maybe about 45 frames per second with Marvel Spider-Man, and it's about the same with God of War as well. Now, all these games are playing with FSR turned off, so you could always use those upscaling technologies if you would like, but I personally like the crisper and clearer version of just playing it with a clean raster. So when it comes to PC gaming, I would consider the Beelink SER9 Pro to be a 1080p mini PC. What I would expect to do is set it to a 1080p resolution right off the bat, and then adjust the graphics fidelity, between low and medium, and see how it plays from there. And then look at the frame rate and see, if it's hovering around, say, 40 or 50, maybe lock the frame rate to that and then use that instead. I think the CPU really shines with older titles. You can often get a 60 frames per second pretty stably in even higher frame rates if you unlock it. But it is also nice to see games like Red Dead Redemption 2 running at a pretty stable 40 frames per second at 1080p low settings. So yes, I think that most PC games are going to be playable on this machine. Now, because it has a USB 4 port on the back, that does mean that you can set it up with external graphics cards. For this setup, I'm using my AOStar AG02. I picked this up maybe about a year ago, and it cost about $250 at the time. I think it's around that price right now as well. This one comes with a built-in 800 watt power supply, so really all you have to do is just pop on your graphics card and then connect it either via Oculink or USB 4 like I'm doing here. My graphics card is the RTX 5070 non-TI version, so this is about a $500 card. It's kind of in that mid-range. So in general, this kind of setup is going to be about $750 for a desktop class GPU running over USB 4. There are some limitations to that connectivity. You're only going to be able to push it 40 gigabit per second, but the results are pretty impressive. If you remember, our previous TimeSpy score was 3487 without any eGPU, just the mini PC itself. When connecting it with this particular eGPU setup, I got a score of 12,656. So we're looking at about a 360% gaming performance increase by using this particular eGPU setup. To put that into real-world context, let's use Ghost of Tsushima as our example. So this game can run at about 1080p low settings, much like the other Sony titles that we were testing before, with an average frame rate about 45-50 frames per second. This is still a decent way to play this game. And with this particular eGPU setup, I can play this game at 4K high settings and still get an average about 45 frames per second. So this is an excellent experience. If I wanted to play it in 1440p, I could get it at a stable 60 as well. Now, personally, I wouldn't have bought this kind of setup just right out of the box. I think if you are going to use a desktop GPU and you're going to be using a stationary mini PC, you might as well just build a desktop PC at that point because you're not saving that much space. Instead, I think an eGPU setup like this is better suited for a handheld gaming device, one that you can take around with you on the go and then plug in and use as a desktop PC when you want to. Either way, my main point here is that if you do pick up a mini PC and you're thinking about upgrading down the line, then it might be in your better interest to actually just get an eGPU setup as opposed to buying a whole new computer. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a review of this AOStar AG02. It's a really cool eGPU enclosure, but I'm not sure how high the interest would be for something like this. Okay, now that we finished PC game testing, let's talk about emulation, one of my favorite uses for these mini PCs. I love the idea of taking one of these things and putting it under your TV and then using it as an emulation box. So let's test out how emulation is running, at least here on Windows. We're going to start with Generation 6, GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, and then work our way up. So starting with GameCube here, I'm playing all these games at a 5x resolution, which is 4K. And almost every single game that I tested played absolutely fine with this particular setup. The only game that gave me a bit of trouble was the same one that gives everyone trouble, Rogue Squadron 2. This one I had to drop down to a 3x resolution or about 1080p. I would still get a couple stutters here and there, especially during an explosion, but this is a very difficult game to emulate. So in general, I think the GameCube is going to be awesome and most games will play in 4K. Now moving over to PlayStation 2, it's very similar, but maybe a little bit more demanding. So there are plenty of games that you can play in 4K, and maybe a couple you would have to drop down to a 4x resolution to be able to play at around 1440p, like Ratchet & Clank. But I did find that the best overall experience with PS2 emulation in particular was to play these games at a 3x resolution, which is going to be a little bit higher than 1080p, but not quite 1440p. And once you set it to this level, all these games are going to play just fine. So that would be my recommendation going forward, is that yes, you could play GameCube at a 5x resolution, but for PS2, if you want a smooth experience without having to fiddle around with every single game, then 3x is going to give you more consistent performance. And then finally, the other Gen 6 system is the original Xbox, which is a lot more difficult to emulate. And so for this one, I just set it to the native resolution and then just played it from there. And I was surprised to find that the performance here is pretty good at a native resolution. So if you look at that video debug box here, it's pretty stable. The FPS is going to hover around 30 frames per second for games that ran at that speed, and then those that ran at 60 frames per second are pretty stable too. You are going to get some dips here and there, and then to be honest, playing these games at the native resolution looks pretty chunky too, but if you are looking for one of the cheaper ways to be able to play original Xbox emulation, this is a pretty good mini PC for that. Now moving on to an emulator that runs a little bit better out of the box is going to be CEMU for Nintendo Wii U gaming. And for this, I just basically set every game to a 1080p resolution, and they all play just fine. You will get some shader compilation stutters as you first start to play the game, like in early levels, but the longer you play it, the better it's going to get. A good example is Splatoon. This is the very first time that I went into this particular level, which is one of the early levels, so a lot of these shaders are just now caching for the very first time. And there are a couple stutters here and there, but honestly, it's not half bad. And once it stabilizes, it's going to be a pretty good 60 frames per second here too. So in general, I would say that yes, for Wii U content at a 1080p resolution, the Beelink here is going to do a great job. The ultimate test is always going to be Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and for this one I set it to a 1080p resolution but then capped it to 40 frames per second. And here you can see that even in a battle with a larger enemy, and even with the rain falling, which is a little bit harder to emulate too, it's still a stable 40 frames per second. So yes, I think that as long as the game runs on the Wii U emulator, it's going to run great on this mini PC. Moving on from there, let's talk about PlayStation 3. Now, usually what I do is I just test all these games at a native resolution when it comes to integrated graphics, but for this video in particular, I decided to step it up a little bit, and so instead, I upscaled all these games to a 1080p resolution instead of the standard 720p. And the difference between 720p and 1080p with this system in particular is kind of night and day. It looks a lot sharper and crisper, and I was happy to report too that most of these games were playing at full speed. So my recommendation would be that if you do plan on playing PS3 on this particular mini PC, you can probably upscale that resolution factor to 125%, which is going to give you a 1080p, and it looks a lot sharper and the performance is still very decent. You are going to get some dips here and there. For example, with Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty, it wasn't a stable 60 frames per second, it would kind of dip left and right, but still a very playable experience. With a lot of these games, the major thing is just keeping it above 30 frames per second, because below that is when you will actually feel slowdown. And so with some games, you might get some choppiness as the frame rate fluctuates, but in general, it's still a very playable experience. The high-end game that I like to test is God of War 3 with this particular battle, because it will always show if something's going wrong, and on average here I got about 50 frames per second. Again, as long as you're staying above 30 frames per second, it's going to be very playable. So yes, I would gladly play through this game at a 1080p resolution with this sort of performance. So yeah, I think the PS3 is going to be an excellent experience. I do a very similar thing with Xbox 360, and then I go into the Xenium Manager, and then I upscale everything to 1080p, and so these games are running a little bit better than they did on the original hardware. Now this emulator is still a work in progress, and so not every game is going to play well, but the standard ones that I like to test, like Crackdown as well as Forza Horizon, were playing just fine at the full 30 frames per second, which they ran at natively. I tried a couple other games that I don't normally test, like Red Dead Redemption, and this one was also playing just great at that 1080p resolution upscale. This emulator will cause some screen tearing, especially with my capture card, so you may be seeing that here on screen, but performance-wise, yes, this is looking great. It also looks like there's been some compatibility improvements with this emulator, because some games that I've never been able to play before, like Halo 3, played absolutely fine, at least through the first level. And so that's kind of surprising to me that I was able to play this game and it still ran very smoothly. In the end, when it comes to Xbox 360 emulation, the biggest limitation is going to be the emulator itself and its compatibility, but more and more games are actually working, and the performance is working pretty great with this integrated graphics card. My guess is that some of this has to do with the fact that the Radeon 780M has been out for a couple years now, and so it's been well developed for. And then finally, the last emulation system that I tested was the Nintendo Switch. I'm running the Eden emulator here, just right from their website. This is the latest release client that was just released the other day, and yeah, it's performing really well. I really feel like this is the emulator that has taken up the mantle of Switch emulation since Yuzu died out a couple years ago. The only major hiccup that I have with Switch emulation are compilation stutters, which are pretty prominent even on Eden. And so when you first start to play a game in those early levels, you are going to get some stutters here and there, but it will smooth out the more you play it. Here's a good example with Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. So in this game, I'm just very early in it, and I'm kind of going into new levels for the first time, and you can see that as I do a new move, or maybe pick up a new item, there will be a little bit of a stutter here and there, but as soon as that happens, then it's usually going to be pretty smooth afterwards. So in general, I would say that yes, Nintendo Switch emulation is going to be pretty great on this. There will be some limitations in terms of how high you can upscale it, but I'm playing all these games in a docked mode, and even challenging games like Super Mario Odyssey are playing really well. So long story short, yes, this seems to be able to emulate just about everything under the sun with a couple hiccups here and there. Okay, so that's it for testing. Let's go ahead and wrap up, talk about what I like and what I don't like about the new Beelink SER9 Pro. Number one, it's got a pretty clean look to it. I like the fact that it's made out of all aluminum, and I also think that the I/O placement and options are really well optimized. We've got USB-C and USB-A on the front, which makes easy access for peripherals, but then we've also got quite a few plugins in the back. And in general, I think that this is a capable 1080p gaming machine, not only when playing PC games, but then upscaling emulation to at least 1080p, if not beyond. You might have to make a couple compromises, like turning it down to low settings or potentially only running it at 40 or 30 frames per second, but in general, yes, you'll be able to play almost every single game at 1080p. The device also does a decent job in cooling. Now, when running a benchmark, I did get scores up to about 88 degrees Celsius, but when actually playing a game, I never saw it go beyond 74 degrees Celsius, and I think that's pretty good for being such a small box that is covered in aluminum. It also has a nearly silent fan, to the point where I never heard it kick in the entire 2 months that I messed around with this machine. But I think most importantly, it's running at a decent price. At $500 right when it's coming out at retail is a really good sign. That means a year from now, it's probably going to be even cheaper and an even better deal at that point, because we'll still have all the good stuff in this column. You know, this excellent performance, the ability to play up to 1080p with excellent cooling, but it may be at a lower price point. I think starting it at $500 in today's environment is a pretty big deal. But of course, it's not perfect, so let's talk about a couple of the things I thought could be better with this particular PC. Number one is the fact that we have that mic array on the front, and it kind of takes away from that really clean look that I talked about before. It's not the end of the world, and these mics might come in handy at some point if you want to use those built-in microphones, but for me personally, I would have loved it to be just a little bit more sleek without those 4 holes on the front. I was also a bit confused by the performance mode, which they advertise on their website. Even changing it in the BIOS did not actually unlock any additional performance, so I think there needs to be a BIOS update on this machine. And then, like with every mini PC review, I always have to talk about the limitations of this particular form factor, because there is good and bad. It's great that it can sit on your desktop and it's going to be nice and quiet and not draw a lot of power, but it is going to be more expensive than building a similar large desktop on your own. And so this is not really a knock on the mini PC itself, but rather just this form factor writ large. At the end of the day, I think this is an excellent mini PC for its price point and probably the easiest one to recommend right now. If we go over to my mini PC comparison chart, which I've been running for about 5 years now, it's got a listing of every mini PC that I've ever reviewed here on this channel. You can see that I've now put in the Beelink SER9 Pro, and I've made it my top pick at around that $500 price point. Prior to this, the Beelink SER8 was my main recommendation, and it's pretty cool that the next year model is the one that I'm replacing it with. Honestly, between the two, there's not a huge difference, but the big thing here is that the SER9 Pro, even during its debut, is cheaper than last year's model. So if you are in the market for something around the $500 price point, then the SER9 Pro is a very easy recommendation. And there's a lot you could do with a mini PC like this beyond just what we talked about in this video. You could use this just as your regular computer, for browsing and taxes, but you could also turn it into a full-fledged gaming console by loading it up with something like Bazite to be able to put this onto your living room TV and then also use it in that regard. At the end of the day, mini PCs like this are the reason why I started doing these reviews in the first place about 5 years ago. It's really exciting to get something like this at a decent price that can play just about everything you want. There are going to be some compromises here and there, but it seems like as time marches on, those compromises become smaller and smaller. It used to be that around this price point, you could find many PC games that wouldn't play at all, and if they did play, it would have to be at a 720p, 30 frames per second level, but now we're doing all of that at 1080p, and often with higher frame rates. So the way I've been thinking about the Beelink SER9 Pro is that it's not the most exciting mini PC in the world. It's kind of nondescript looking, it's not super attractive, but man, it really gets the job done. And sometimes I think it's these type of nondescript smaller mini PCs that really become sleeper hits because they're versatile, they're powerful, and the price point is not half bad. There are a ton of different mini PCs for cheaper, usually around the $300, $350 price point, but the performance is going to be nowhere close to this one. And so in general, I would say that this seems to be that sweet spot where it's not going to hurt too much on your wallet, but you're still going to get excellent performance. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you got a mini PC or in the market for one? Is the SER9 Pro going to do it for you? At the end of the day, if you've already got something similar like the old SER8, then obviously it's not worth upgrading, but now is a great time to jump into it. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.